Okay, so my name is Laura Anthony, and this is my book review, book report of our assignment. And the book that I read was I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness by Austin Channing Brown. I'm going to go through each of the chapters, kind of talk about what I thought was interesting, summarize each of them, and tie that into what I believe the overall thesis is of the book. So, basically, what I believe that the author, Austin Brown, is trying to depict, the main idea, is that she basically goes through a narrative of different experiences that she's had growing up as a black woman in a predominantly white neighborhood, in a predominantly white professional institution. And basically, the main point that I believe Brown is making by writing this book is how the white middle class evangelistic person has participated in a time of rising racial hostility. I believe she does an excellent job having the reader confront apathy and recognize God's ongoing work in the world. Basically, definitely a journey, a narrative. She goes through a lot of different experiences that, for me personally, I could never imagine having to live through. So, first chapter is called White People Are Exhausting. So, as you can imagine, for me as a white person, kind of took me aback a little bit, but really fascinating, really interesting. Basically, in the first chapter, she talks about her first name being Austin and how that's usually associated with a white man. And she talks about the specific story. She was at a library as a child. She tries to check out a lot of books. She gives the librarian her card. The librarian doesn't understand how her name could be Austin. She keeps asking her, "Are you sure this is your name?" Or "Are you sure this is your library card?" And Austin, she's just exhausted by people questioning her name, and she asks her mom, "Why did you name me Austin?" And her mom gives an explanation. It's a family name, but what's really important and interesting is that, quote, she said that anyone who saw it, her name, before meeting you would assume you are a white man. One day you will apply for jobs. We, as her parents, just wanted to make sure you could make it to the interview. That took me aback. That was very shocking. That's something that I don't even have to consider. I feel like I don't have to consider my name getting me an interview because it sounds white. So just thought that was really interesting. So basically, she talks about growing up as a black girl in a predominantly white middle-class neighborhood. The second chapter, she talks about how when her parents got divorced, she would spend time at her dad's house, and that was at a more of a black neighborhood. And her peers, a kid that she knew, they would ask her, why is she talking white? And why does she kind of act like white people? And she didn't realize that she was doing that subconsciously. She was taking on the white culture. And in that chapter, it's an introduction to her dad's church, which was predominantly black, and it was a black church, and how much she felt so comfortable there and loved. The third chapter is called The Other Side of Harmony. This basically goes through her experiences in school, and that she talks about there's a harmony aspect because there wasn't any overt racism that she experiences with her teachers, other students. She also felt like she was on the spot a lot, being one of a handful of black students in a class. And she felt like she had to represent her race. The fourth chapter is called Ain't No Friends Here. She talks about her experiences in college and how she finally had a black teacher, a black professor, and how comfortable she felt in that class. And this professor would make references, and she would understand what the references are and how different that was from grade school, basically. Fifth chapter is called Whiteness at Work, and she talks about being a black woman in a professional world of majority white in a nonprofit ministry, and how difficult it was for her. She actually goes through a list of life hacks for a black woman who works in a predominantly white institution, and how to survive, and again, just a lot of assumptions that are made on her that I just can't imagine living through. Chapter 6, White Fragility. She learned that being the first black woman in an authority figure, how that can be really intense for a white person. And she talked about an altercation while working. She was giving a session, and a white man was really upset with what she was saying, and he kept demanding to talk to the person in charge while she was the person in charge, and how hurt she was by that experience. Chapter 7, Nice White People. She talks about this aspect, or this kind of theory she has of called relational defense. Basically, when a white person uses relationships to defend one's racism, that a white person can be racist, but then they'll back it up with saying, "Oh, well, if you really knew me, that I have many black friends." They use that relational aspect to defend themselves, which I thought was interesting. Chapter 8. It's called The Story We Tell, and how many Americans try to live comfortably in the ignorance of America's racial history. And basically she talks about how there are white people who will say, well, we've come so far. We've made a lot of strides. But she doesn't think that is something to settle for, that it can basically, we need to be better at it. Chapter 9, Creative Anger, that's the title. She talks about how when she's angry as a black female, she is considered to be dangerous, explosive, and her anger's unwarranted, and just because of her race and her gender. She gave the reference of when Jesus was angry in the temple when it was used for selling goods. So basically she talks about that emotion of being angry. Chapter 10, The Ritual of Fear. She talks about a specific experience with her cousin, an older cousin who's a black man who had his shoes stolen, and he was considering of getting a gun to go back and get his shoes. And she talks about how later in his life he became sucked into selling drugs, and that was his way of earning money, and that he went to prison. And she talks a little bit about the injustice of so many innocent black men go to jail because of their race, and how atrocity that is. Next chapter, it's called We're Still Here. She talks about some events in history. She talks about President Obama being elected. She talks about the black man being shot in Ferguson by a white officer. He was unarmed. The shooting that occurred in Charleston, South Carolina, and the fear that goes around that she felt like she really took on. And an interesting quote, she said that racism never really went away, it just evolved into these different things. Next chapter, justice, then reconciliation. So we're kind of getting into the conclusion of the book. and she talks about how justice and reconciliation, they go hand in hand. And she talks about that there needs to be more action in not just having these conversations. She thinks conversations are important when it comes to realizing the injustice and the progress to get towards a reconciliation, but then there needs to be action. So an interesting quote, she says that reconciliation is what Jesus does. It's an action. So he didn't only talk about forgiving people and the freedom that he brings, but that Jesus died on the cross for all of us. And that was an action to bring reconciliation within humanity. So again, she just really reiterating action to backing it up. The last chapter is called Standing in the Shadow of Hope. It was a pretty short chapter to conclude her book. Interesting quote. She says, "I need a love that is troubled by injustice." And that's a really big takeaway for me, that just being aware of all these different experiences that Austin Brown went through, I can't help but feel empathy and just being aware of her life and the experiences that she has. I just had no idea that a woman of her color would experience. And it just really opened my eyes. She believes, she does have hope. It's kind of, she kind of ends the book with this idea that she is not God, that God is God and I am not. And she does have a hope for a better future. And she does include a letter that she wrote to her future son. She was pregnant at the time writing this book. She wrote a letter to her son, and she talks about the things that she's looking forward to, but then how does she have these hard conversations with her son about being a black boy, a black man eventually. So, I think a lot of the book and what she talks about ties into what we have talked about in this course so far. The idea that racism is really linked to power, and that there is this institutional discrimination, and she talked a lot about that in her workforce and her work position. One of the key quotes that I think really sum this up was from the article from Allen, the 1999. He states that whites typically do not see how they are socially privileged because they do not know much about the daily experiences of people of color. And by reading this book, there's just so many experiences that I had, again, no idea that someone of that race would experience, and just created an understanding. It just really opened my eyes, an illumination, as you could say, of Austin Brown's experiences. So, very grateful to have read this. It was, like I said, very eye-opening, and I believe really tied into a lot of what we have been talking about in this class. So, highly recommend the book.